The winter of 1945 settled over Europe with a quiet weight. Snow covered the ground, but there was nothing gentle about it. Its muted sound softened outlines and seemed to close in on a continent, already worn down by years of war. Villages stood still. Forests felt watchful. And somewhere within that frozen landscape a young American soldier found himself surrounded. He did not plead. He did not panic. He laughed. It was the kind of reaction that did not fit the moment, sharp, unexpected. The kind that makes people hesitate if only for a second. And in war a second can change everything. What followed would be over in less than a minute. But it would leave behind a story that lingered far longer. By January 1945, the war had already reshaped the world. Beyond recognition. The old sense of order, of stable borders, predictable lives, and clear futures had eroded. Across Europe, cities bore the marks of sustained conflict. Rail lines carried soldiers and supplies, but also the weight of uncertainty. Civilians adapted as best they could, moving through days defined by rationing, absence, and quiet endurance. For those at the front, life had narrowed to immediate needs. Food when available. Rest when possible. Survival above all else. There was little room for anything beyond that. Conditions were harsh, the environment unforgiving, and the threat of sudden violence constant. Every movement required attention. Every sound could mean something. Near the German border, in cold and difficult terrain, patrols moved cautiously through wooded areas. Visibility was limited. Footing was uncertain. The landscape offered as much danger as protection. Staff Sergeant Leonard Funk Jr. was part of one such patrol. He was not widely known at the time. Not a figure of headlines or public recognition. He was one of many, an American soldier serving far from home, shaped by months of combat and the steady pressure of frontline duty. Like others in his position, he carried more than just his equipment. Training had taught him how to move, how to respond, how to stay alive. But experience had added something else, an instinct that develops only under sustained pressure, a sense of timing, an understanding that hesitation, even briefly, could have serious consequences. Before the war, his life had likely followed a familiar rhythm, work-family routine, a sense that the future, while uncertain, could still be planned. That certainty had disappeared. By 1945, time felt compressed. Decisions came quickly and their outcomes were immediate. The moment itself began without any sense of scale or significance. A patrol moving through snow. Careful steps. Watchful eyes. Then suddenly contact. Gunfire broke through the stillness. Voices rose, orders, warnings, partially lost in the confusion. Shapes moved between trees, difficult to distinguish. Snow and smoke blurred the scene, reducing everything to fragments. In that confusion, separation happened quickly. One moment part of a unit, the next alone. It is a situation soldiers are trained to avoid but not always able to prevent. Terrain visibility and timing can shift in an instant. And once alone, the situation changes entirely. Funk found himself cut off. German soldiers moved in. Weapons were raised. Commands were issued, clear in intent even without translation. Surrender. In that moment, the broader war receded. There were no larger objectives, no maps or strategies, just an immediate choice. Resist with little chance of success. Or comply and accept uncertainty. Funk lowered his weapon. He was taken prisoner. In theory, capture marked a transition. A soldier became a prisoner, disarmed, controlled, removed from active combat. There were established procedures, expectations about how such situations would unfold. But reality often differed from theory. Conditions varied. Guards were often under strain. Fatigue, tension, and the unpredictability of war affected everyone involved. Even routine movements could carry risk. Funk was under guard, being moved. The situation appeared stable. The German soldiers had the advantage. They had control. At least that is how it seemed. But control in combat is rarely absolute. It can shift quickly, sometimes without warning. What matters is recognizing when it does. In this case, the shift was subtle. A slight easing of attention. A momentary assumption that the situation was secure. Small changes easily overlooked. Yet those are often the moments where outcomes are decided. Funk recognized it. Not as a fully formed plan, but as an opening. And then he laughed. It was not humor. It was not relief. It was abrupt. Out of place. Enough to interrupt the expected rhythm of the moment. For an instant it created uncertainty. And in that uncertainty he acted. What followed unfolded rapidly. There was no time for careful calculation. No opportunity for structured maneuvering. The situation changed in bursts, quick, decisive movements shaped by instinct and necessity. A weapon was seized. A guard caught off balance. Confusion spread through the group as the situation shifted from control to crisis. Close quarters worked against the larger force. Limited visibility, overlapping movement, and the sudden loss of coordination made it difficult to respond effectively. In such conditions, numbers do not always translate to advantage. Funk moved with focus, responding moment to moment. There was no room for hesitation. Every action needed to be immediate, purposeful. The entire encounter lasted approximately 45 seconds. When it ended, 21 German soldiers had been neutralized. The figure is difficult to fully process, not because it is beyond possibility, but because of how much it represents in such a short span of time. So much action compressed into less than a minute. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The noise faded. The stillness returned. But it felt different, heavier, more defined by what had just occurred. Stories like this are often remembered for their intensity, for the speed, the outcome, the unexpected nature of what took place. But they also point to something more complex. War is not only about strategy or outcomes. It is also about individuals, each with their own experiences, their own perspectives, their own place within a larger conflict. The German soldiers involved in that moment were not abstract figures. Many were young. Some were likely conscripts. Others had endured years of fighting by that stage of the war. They carried personal histories, families, memories, beliefs shaped by the circumstances they had lived through. And in a brief and chaotic encounter, those individual paths came to an abrupt end. War does not pause to consider those details. It moves forward, shaped by decisions made in seconds. Funk survived that moment. Others did not. That contrast is part of the reality of combat. As the war moved toward its conclusion, accounts like this began to circulate more widely. Soldiers shared them with one another, stories of narrow escapes, unexpected outcomes, moments where instinct and timing made the difference. They were not always told in full detail. Some were simplified. Others expanded slightly in the retelling. But they served a purpose. They helped make sense of experiences that were often difficult to process. For American forces, such accounts reinforced the idea that individual action still mattered even within a conflict defined by large-scale operations. For German forces, each loss contributed to a growing awareness that their situation was deteriorating. The broader outcome of the war was becoming increasingly clear. Even so, the conflict continued, shaped by countless smaller encounters like this one. Beyond the immediate moment, the war itself was already transforming the global landscape. Political structures shifted. Alliances reformed. Economies adjusted to new realities. The scale of the conflict accelerated. Developments in technology, logistics, and international coordination. But alongside these visible changes, there were quieter effects, psychological ones. Soldiers returned from the war carrying experiences that did not easily translate into everyday life. Moments of extreme pressure, brief, intense, and decisive, left lasting impressions. For some, these became stories shared over time, framed as examples of resilience or survival. For others, they remained internal, difficult to articulate, because surviving such moments is not simply a matter of victory. It often comes with complexity, questions, memories, and a perspective shaped by circumstances few others have experienced. Even during the war, there were those who questioned the systems that had led to such widespread destruction. Writers, thinkers, and ordinary individuals reflected on the causes and consequences, asking, what kind of world would emerge once the fighting stopped? Those questions did not have immediate answers, but they influenced what came next. Efforts to establish international cooperation, to define human rights more clearly, and to prevent future conflicts all drew in part from the experiences of this period. At the same time, the underlying tensions did not disappear entirely. History has shown that lessons are not always fully absorbed. Patterns can reappear even when their outcomes are well understood. The events of January 1945 are recorded in many ways through documents, personal accounts, and the broader timeline of the war. But they are also preserved through moments like this one. Moments defined not by large-scale strategy but by individual decisions made under pressure. Leonard Funk Jr. experience stands as one example. It highlights how quickly circumstances can change, how narrow the margin between control and vulnerability can be, and how much can depend on timing and instinct. It also raises questions, not only about what happened but about the conditions that made it possible. Situations where survival depends on actions that outside of war would never be considered. That is part of the reality such stories reflect. Today, the locations where these events took place are quieter. Natural landscapes have recovered in many areas. Forests have grown. Seasonal rhythms have returned. The visible signs of conflict have in some cases faded. But the history remains. It exists in records, in memories passed down through generations, and in the ways societies have been shaped by what occurred. Because history is not only about the past, It informs the present through institutions, through perspectives, and through the stories that continue to be told. In the end, one image remains. A soldier isolated, surrounded, and captured. A moment that appeared final. And then something unexpected. A brief interruption. A shift. 45 seconds that altered the outcome. Followed by a silence that carried more weight than before. Was it training? Instinct? A response shaped by everything that had come before? It may have been a combination of all three. Or simply the nature of war itself, where certainty is rare and outcomes can change in an instant. The war eventually ended. Reconstruction began. Nations moved forward. But moments like this continue to exist within the larger story, not as isolated incidents but as reflections of the conditions in which they occurred. They remind us that history is not only made through major events but also through brief, decisive moments. Moments that pass quickly yet leave a lasting imprint. Because history does not disappear. It carries forward, reshaped by time. And in quiet ways, it is reborn.